There we go. And like I said, we're going to run through the tech check for our TMN Tuesday August event a little early so that we give our speaker the full allotted time and Mr. Powell can start right at noon as scheduled. We're excited to have Wade as our speaker today to talk about the Bastrop fire 10 years later, and Michelle's going to introduce our speaker here in just a moment. If you are new to our TMN Tuesday event, welcome. We always want to run through a quick tech check to make sure that everybody is able to hear and interact with our speaker as we've designed the system to do. If you are new and you're worried that you cannot unmute or you cannot turn on your video, don't worry. That is on purpose. We do have, in some cases, over a couple thousand attendees, and we don't want a screen full of potentially squawking birds. I love this picture. It makes me smile every time. So do not worry, you cannot unmute or you cannot show your video, and that is on purpose. But we do have ways that you'll be able to interact with Mr. Powell, our speaker today. The next thing that we want to make sure that you are able to do is that you're able to, excuse me, you're able to hear our speaker today. So make sure that you can, if you can see my mouth moving, you should be able to hear me talking. So if you are not able to hear us right now, you're going to take a little look at this screen and make sure that you are following that audio menu at the top of your screen to check your audio connections. In some cases, it's just making sure that your volume is turned up. In other cases, we've heard making sure that your speakers are plugged into the wall. That's been an issue in the past. So it's not a Monday, but some days it feels like Tuesdays are the new Mondays. So again, make sure that you can hear us so that you can participate with our speaker today. And then last but not least, if you have not been on one of our WebEx events before, we are going to be using our Q&A box with Mr. Powell today. Our Q&A is a way that we can facilitate questions and deliver those to Mr. Powell during the allotted time that he has in his presentation for discussion. So you are welcome to ask your questions at any point throughout our Mr. Powell's presentation today. And then during those allotted discussion times, Michelle and I will unmute and we will verbally ask those questions to Mr. Powell. To help us ask the question that you're intending us to ask, please use full and clear sentences, no acronyms, and of course, as always, please be respectful and professional with your questions and stay on topic as well. If you select that all panelists in the Q&A box, that helps make sure that Michelle and I both see the question at the same time so that we can race to see who gets to ask that question first. All right, and then last but not least, for our tech check as we're wrapping close to that noon hour, if you're still having issues with our WebEx, we do have a help phone number to call and a website that you can go to at any point as well. So take a quick screenshot of that if you're still having issues. And if you're still here, then it sounds like you don't have any issues. All right, and with that, Michelle, if you'll kick us off and introduce our presentation today and our speaker as well.
Yeah, so TMN Tuesday, welcome to our TMN Tuesday event. This in August 2021, we are just a couple of weeks out from the 10th anniversary of our state's most devastating fire to date. And so we found it fitting to hear about kind of the reaching, as we're nearing that 10th anniversary, hear about what's called Fire in the Pines, the past, present, and future of fire in Bastrop State Park, and learn about what that event has taught us, and from the past, present, and even into the future. And it seems even more fitting today as we're experiencing or watching other communities experience some devastating wildfires in the West. I'm certain that the things that we have been able to learn as a result of our own devastating fire here in Texas can help us help that information. That information can be applied in not only the Bastrop community and the Bastrop State Park, but other communities across Texas and the nation and their natural areas and parks as well. Next slide, please. As a reminder, we have these TMN Tuesdays every month. Something's new that we started this year. Our TMN Tuesday Advanced Training event is the second Tuesday of each month from 12 to noon. This month is, of course, Fire in the Pines. Next month, in September, we have advanced training topic on squirrels. And while we're talking advanced training, I do want to remind, or if you haven't heard this yet, our biggest advanced training event for the program happening in October, which is our statewide annual meeting, registration just opened for that last week. So everyone on today is welcome to register and attend that hybrid meeting. There's an in-person session and a virtual session. And if you want more information on that, you can check out our website at txmn.tamu.edu to learn more information about the annual meeting. While we're here, we also want to invite you to our a subsidiary TMN Tuesday is our Be the Change series, where we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion topics for master naturalists and conservation organizations all across Texas to help begin and continue that conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion within your organizations and your communities statewide. That event will be held next week, August 17th, and Javier De Leon will be our featured speaker for the Be the Change series. Moving ahead, Mary Pearl adequately covered the webinar etiquette. Just use that Q&A function. We will try to keep on time so you can keep on time with the rest of your day too. Use the Q&A function. We will help moderate those questions to Mr. Paul at the end of the event. Lastly, again, if you're experiencing any difficulties with WebEx, your sound, or anything else, we have the help link there on the screen for you. All of our TMN Tuesday advanced training events are recorded and up on our website. We will do our best to share the recording by tomorrow morning of this event. And all of these events are available to master naturalists as advanced training to watch either live or recorded. And then without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Wade Powell. Wade is the Habitat Stewardship Coordinator at the Lost Pines Complex in Bastrop for the Lost Pines Parks Complex. He was a wildland firefighter with the Texas A&M Forest Service for 9 years. This time included the 2011 fire season and the event that happened in Bastrop with the Bastrop County Complex Fire in 2011, the event that we're actually talking about today. Wade recently came to TPWD after leading a land management crew in Travis County, and he comes to us having a bachelor's degree in anthropology and sociology from Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois. So welcome, Wade, and welcome to the family. Welcome to the Master Naturalist family. And we're so excited for your talk today. Eager to learn everything that you have to share with us.
All right, great. Thank you, Michelle. Thanks for the warm welcome. I am going to share my screen. Right now, that button is grayed out. Oh, there we go. And here we go. Let me know if that becomes visible to y'all.
Yes, it is.
All right, awesome, very good. So thanks again for the warm welcome, and I'm glad to be a part of the team here at TPWD. So today we're going to be discussing the fire-dependent ecosystems in the park. We're going to talk about the conditions, the disruption to those ecosystems, and the conditions that led to the historic wildfire of 2011. We'll talk about the effects of that wildfire, and we'll talk about the current management practices that we're undertaking in order to restore and manage this very unique ecosystem here at Bastrop State Park. We'll look at best management practices going forward to make fire a healthy part of the ecosystem and a part of the landscape once again. And at the end of this program today, you as participants should feel empowered to go out and manage and advocate for resilient landscapes and resilient habitats here in Texas. So I'm going to go ahead and head right into it. Okay. So again, we use the term fire adapted ecosystem, but I would even say that the lost pines are a fire dependent ecosystem. We need the lost pines need regular low intensity fire to promote pine regeneration and to kind of keep the oak species in check. The oaks, of course, are a part of the lost pines ecosystem, but fire really helps maintain the balance between them and the local population of drought hardy loblolly pine. For those of you not familiar with the area, the loblollies here are a disjunct population separated from the nearest piney woods by hundreds of miles. So the nearest ones are due east of here in the piney woods of East Texas. And so as a disjunct population, the loblollies here are unique to Central Texas. The species composition is more similar to what you would see in the eastern part of the state or even further southeast, the southeastern United States. However, the pines that grow here are uniquely adapted to this ecosystem. So they're tolerant of the drier, hotter conditions, or certainly the drier conditions that we experience here in Central Texas, as opposed to the more moist, humid environments that you see further east. And historically, we believe, due to some of the science that I'll present to you a little later, that the stand of pines that you see here today would have been much more open in the past. So more of a savanna or park-like environment. Certainly more of a woodland than a closed canopy forest, where you would have large, widely spaced trees and a grassy understory because of the light that was allowed to reach the forest floor. And that was really brought about by fire. Either lightning started or lit by indigenous inhabitants. The fire would have reduced that tree density to a level that grasses and actually a very diverse grass community that could have supported a variety of wildlife would have been able to thrive. So this is a product of the Joint Fire Science Program, which is run by the National Park Service and the U.S. Forest Service. And it's based on climatological data that they married up with field data from nearly 200 sites around the country, where they were able to find fire scars on trees. So, using dendrochronology, and then also look at charcoal layers in the soil, whether it's at the bottom of a lake or just soil cores. And then correlate that to climatological data in those areas, precipitation and atmospheric chemistry. They were able to sort of project those fire histories across the United States to try to determine, using that model, how frequently fire would have been in any given location, at least at a broad scale. So as you can see, and I'm going to turn on my laser pointer here. As you can see here in Central Texas, we would have had, according to this model, a very frequent return interval of fire. That would be as frequent as, or more frequent than, once every 2 years. So that's a very aggressive a very frequent fire return interval. Fires burning that frequently would have kept the fuel loading on the landscape very low, and would have and would have kept the fires therefore relatively low intensity, because there wouldn't have been a whole lot on the forest floor or under a grass understory. There wouldn't have been a lot of fuels for it to consume, so they would have been frequent and very low intensity fires. Following the Bastrop complex, there was a chance to sort of take this broad landscape level data and take it down to the local level. Mark Stanbaugh, Greg Creasy, who works for TPWD, and Jeff Sparks, who is also in the Natural Resources Program here at TPWD, carried out this study. Stanbaugh's in Missouri. And the field work was carried out by TPWD Natural Resources staff, and they went to post oaks that had been top killed in the fire, cut down the post oaks. Since they chose ones that had all died in that event, and then cut what we call cookies out of them, which are just thin slivers of the tree trunk, to be able to count the rings and to find the fire scars inside those rings, in order to develop a local fire history, find out when were the fires, what years were they, and how frequently across a range they would have burned. And this turned out to be a very fruitful set of data. It turned out that the post oaks on the park were some of the oldest and slowest growing post oaks in the United States, and the trees were anywhere between 125 and almost 400 years old. Within that span of time, or at least within the span of time leading up to settlement, which was in the 1820s, 1830s, the average fire frequency was 11 years. So that shows a little bit broader or a little bit longer of a return interval than the Joint Fire Science study did. But again, these were only fires that would have been intense enough to cause a tree scar, so it wouldn't necessarily have captured some of the lowest frequency fires. And also, we have to keep in mind that was a broad projection, and this was an extremely small sample-sized area. And within this area, it didn't even account for all slopes, all aspects, and all ecotypes. But one thing we did notice or one thing that the people who conducted the study noticed was that starting in the 1820s and 1830s, there was a disruption in that historic fire regime, followed by 75 years of total fire suppression, which of course was not just a policy choice here locally, but during that 75 years also was echoed on the national scale in the form of policy of putting out all fires, no matter the cause. So as a result of that period of disruption and fire suppression, mind you that the first disruption would have been a period of logging in the 1830s, followed by some natural regeneration in the pines, another period of logging in the 1880s, and then a final period of logging in the 20th century, followed by the CCC actually replanting a large portion of the pines in the 30s. But concurrent with that was this policy of total fire suppression, or this culture, really, even more than a policy of total fire suppression. So as a result of these disturbances and this period of suppression, we witnessed a dense accumulation of woodland fuels. And in the wildland fire context, a fuel is any vegetative material that might burn under any circumstances. So it includes live trees, grasses, accumulations of dead fuel on the forest floor, so pine duff, pine needles, oak leaves, and also shrubs that grow in between them. So we saw the emergence of what we call ladder fuels So if you picture kind of what I talked about with the open understory, that would have been invaded by encroaching woody species, shrubs such as yaupon, particularly yaupon and beautyberry, which would have then formed a continuous layer of fuels from the forest floor all the way to the bottom branches of the pine trees, so that there's essentially a wick that leads from the forest floor to the forest canopy. With that also, the stand density was much higher following this period of fire suppression. So instead of widely dispersed large trees, you had dense stands of smaller trees very close together. And the large trees that did exist were also encroached by a number of smaller trees surrounding them. And so that's sort of the long-term effects of that. And it all culminated in the drought of 2011. So that drought began late 2007, early 2008. 2007 was a wet year. And then really the faucet turned off, and the drought lasted into 2011. So this was a drought of record for the area. And the vegetation responded with some extremely low live fuel moisture. So I believe the loblolly was in the 70% range, and the yaupon was as low as 50%, as taken as a percentage of the dry weight of the plant. So these are extremely low numbers. The plants were still visually green, but they were extremely stressed and ready to go up if given the ignition. And then in the extreme short term, there was a set of critical fire weather conditions that lined up as a result of Tropical Storm Lee. So this is a picture of Lee hitting Louisiana. It brought no moisture to the area, but it did bring in a strong, very dry northerly wind on its lee side. So it was pulling that into itself, and that wind swept across Bastrop County, resulting in the conditions that led to the Bastrop complex. That would have been winds gusting up to 30 miles per hour, or in the 30s, and relative humidity values in the single digits, which, if you're not familiar with the area, that is absurdly dry for the area. So as Michelle noted, this was one of the most destructive fires in the state's history. By many metrics, it was the most destructive fire in the state's history. And it really happened under the worst case scenario. It had both the generational effects of fire suppression, followed by a critical drought, followed by very extreme weather conditions. And even so, the fire burned with varying severity. It was not a uniform burn across it. And there were a number of factors that affected this, but I just wanted to bring up this point, which is that, often in the media you hear the term, the fire destroyed so many thousand acres, as if those acres just then became a vacuum or a black hole or something, when in reality, all fires burn with some form of a mosaic pattern. So this was a study carried out by Creasy and I believe Raven Environmental that showed the different burn classes, the burn severity classes across the burn scar and within the park. And you can see that while much of it was heavily burned, there were also areas that were only scorched, where the fire crept through on the forest floor and just browned out some leaves, essentially. So we can look at the differences in those effects in these pictures from heavily burned areas, which would have had a lot of bare soil after killing 100% of the trees and consuming almost 100% of the shrub layer. In this burn class, it burned so hot and held on to heat so long that it actually consumed the organic layer of the soil as well. That soil, or that layer, Part of it volatilized, as happens in very severe fires, and crept into the pores in the soil and created what we call hydrophobic soils when those gases yet again cooled down and hardened. Hydrophobic soils following severe wildfires lead to, or can lead to, severe erosion. Rain precipitation that falls on a hydrophobic soil will bead up, and rain that falls hard enough or with a great enough volume actually completely sheets off of it and causes layers of the soil or whole sections of the soil to slough off. So using my laser pointer again, this was the original soil level before incision following a rain event immediately following the fire. So you can see erosion was a major concern in those areas that received heavy burn intensity. Moderate burn still killed 100% of the trees, because as you can see, it didn't necessarily defoliate them, and top killed the shrubs, but maybe didn't consume them as completely. The litter was consumed, but the soil was not necessarily sterilized as in the heavy burn class. In lightly burned areas, there was an immediate 60 to 80% tree mortality, with more mortality over time. In the years that follows, these trees may have made it through the fire, but over time they were stressed. What they did have time to do was reseed, and even there was some of that in the moderate burned area as well. In areas that scorched, you can see what even in the picture on the right, you can see an example of how the burn was mosaic. There's areas of that picture that probably saw no fire, and really this looks similar to the fire effects after a light fire or even a prescribed burn in some conditions. There was less tree mortality here, less than 10 immediately post-fire. Again, some of them did get stressed because of how critically dry they were before the fire and died later, but there was little mortality to begin with. So looking at the effects of the wildfire a little bit longer term, there was concern that oak resprout. Oaks resprout very vigorously following, especially a high intensity fire, whereas pine trees would not have had a way in the worst burn classes, or the heaviest burn classes, to naturally reseed. So there was a possibility of sort of an oak takeover of the lost pines. And this demonstrates, this was taken maybe 3 or 4 years ago in an area that has seen no treatment since the fire. So you can see a landscape dominated more by oaks, bacarisk, and with a much, and even yaupon, with a much lower percentage of pines as part of the population. What the fire also did was alter the species composition in general. So immediately in the first 5 years following the fire, there was a jump in black oak and cottonwood, as you see in this picture. What we have seen over time is that these early successional species have started to decline again, to represent less and less of a percentage of the canopy cover as the pine and oaks naturally regenerate or are replanted. So while this was an immediate flush, it was just an early kind of ecological succession for the most part. And it also opened a lot of bare ground, which, as many of you probably know, is an open invitation for invasive exotics, as seen here with Chinese tallow, KR blue stem, Chinaberry, ligustrum, and other species, paspalum. So immediately post-burn, the first objective really was burn area emergency response. Even before restoration could take place, something had to be done to slow erosion. So here, this shows AmeriCorps crews putting in erosion socks And then also hydromulching with native seed. So the hydromulch contained a native seed mix that was gathered at Camp Swift here in Bastrop County of little blue stem to try to hold the banks in place. The areas that were chosen for this burned area emergency response would have been the areas of the highest burn intensity and the steepest slopes that were most at danger of eroding under rain events. But as you can see, this was just taken last month. The damage in the picture actually occurred in 2017 during Hurricane Harvey, when Smithville saw about 30 inches of rain. So erosion will be an ongoing problem as we manage the park, even just from the point of view of maintaining burn infrastructure such as fire breaks and access roads. And then erosion long term, these are areas that experience high levels of erosion. Recovery is going to take longer in these areas and require more intensive planting and attention in general. So it is, as I said, the lost pines are a disjunct population of loblollies, so they're really at the edge of what they can tolerate, what they can actually grow in and thrive in. So there were some unique challenges to reforesting with pine seedlings. So areas that were targeted, again, were areas that were in that heavy burn class. Eventually the pines would have been able to reseed themselves, but we would be looking at more of a generational effort at that stage, or even longer, for areas that had moderate to only scorch to be able to reseed into areas of high burn intensity. So in order to accelerate that process and also to bring in the community and get them involved in the recovery, the park managers decided to plant pine seedlings that were grown from this locally sourced seed. So the Texas A&M Forest Service had some growing in a seed orchard in East Texas that were planted from the lost pines. And since then, there's also been seed harvesting directly on the park, so that we're getting an even more hyper-localized seed stock to reforest with. And again, targeting those areas that have been hit the hardest by the fire and would have taken longest to naturally regen, if at all. We learned a few things from this process. There were areas that had to be planted repeatedly, up to 3 times before enough of them survived to really take. And this was due to a number of factors, a dry spell after the planting or hot weather during the planting, snap freezes such as the one in February killed off a lot of the ones that were planted this year. So it's really not a one and done. It's a repeated process. And if you plant pines in East Texas, say, the best management practice is to use herbicide to suppress the surrounding herbaceous plants. It was found here in Bastrop that surrounding herbaceous layer was actually needed to protect the seedling pines from the severe weather extremes here in Bastrop County. And areas that were treated for competition control saw higher mortality than areas that were just planted directly into grasses and forbs. And of course, there was variation depending on things like aspect and slope, the soil type. There was much less, there was much more success in areas that didn't get the kind of intensive site prep that you normally see in a forestry planting. What I mean by that is oftentimes in replanting after say across a clear cut, the site will be burned, heavily suppressed with herbicides to give those pine seedlings the competitive advantage. Here, it was found that even dead standing, the shade provided by some of these snags you see in the background there was enough to provide a little bit of shelter to emerging seedlings. And then, of course, areas that were able to naturally regenerate, that were able to seed on their own, saw the most vigorous regeneration. And in this area, the next step will really be looking at how do we thin that to create a healthy stand rather than, how do we get things to grow? Because obviously, nature has been doing it better than we have, as that picture indicates. So going forward, there are a number of tools that we're going to be using and that we have been using in order to manage what we have, in order to also restore the structure and the composition of the forest back to what we historically can determine was there and what is also the healthiest given the site conditions and the current and expected climate predictions. So, we've treated 3,631 acres since 2015 with prescribed fire. And this is in a really challenging environment. The fuel type that we're dealing with is really a novel one and an evolving one. Rather than a traditional pine forest, what we have is an accumulation of dead and down material from the 2011 fire in many areas, interspersed with shrubs and fine fuels, which contribute to a quick fire spread. All the time we're trying to preserve the pine overstory. So that really narrows down the treatment window that we have, the weather parameters we can burn under and still meet objectives. Those objectives being to consume the dead material and stay inside the box, so to speak. That fuel model evolves every year. So as those large dead fuels decay and more of the fine fuels grow in there, fine fuels being grasses, forbs, and even these pine seedlings, that fuel model evolves and changes every year. We have stands on the forest that are extremely thick, what they would call in East Texas a dog hair stand, and underneath it are massive logs from the 2011 fire. So that will be a very challenging fuel type to burn in, but one that we feel is worth it in order to preserve this unique and restore this unique ecosystem. But these parameters are yearly being refined, and we're getting better at meeting those objectives within that new fuel type. One of the reasons we think it's worth it is that the fire showed us that prescribed fires do reduce wildfire severity. This photo here shows very close to the desired future condition that we want. This is that open canopy with an herbaceous understory. It's multi-age, so you can see there is a little bit of young pine coming in, young pine recruitment to replace the older understory or the older overstory. But as a whole, it's very open and would support low intensity frequent fire. And this is post-fire, post-wildfire in an area that had been burned the year preceding. This shows an area on Gocher Trace. The area on the right was not burned prior to the fire, and the area on the left was burned 10 months before the fire. So that picture kind of speaks for itself in terms of using prescribed fire to dampen wildfire severity and lessen the impacts to the ecosystem and community. We are using herbicide as well to influence the species composition in forest understory, for instance, which is what's going on here. This crew is treating Yopon in a stand that's very close to where we want it to be. Now, mind you, of course, not every stand can look like this all the time. There was a variation both geographically and temporally. As we know, ecosystems aren't static things. They change over time. But this is sort of the mature stand that that we believe that we're, according to our best science, that we're targeting as a condition. We also use herbicides to treat invasive exotics, and then there have been an experimental use of targeted herbicide in oakery sprouts. So on this slide, you can see this area was burned more moderately or even low to scorch intensity. These pines were able to naturally reseed, but they weren't able to reach all the way across here. So this area had been extremely thick with nothing but oakery sprouts. This is post-treatment. An herbicide called Spike was used just as a thinning treatment. Not every oak was treated. It was just used to knock back the regen in the oak and give the pines a little bit of a fighting chance in that area. And then, of course, we also have been and will be implementing mechanical and hand thinning to achieve the desired forest structure. The photo up on the upper left is of a mulching project along the park boundary. As you can see, the mature pines have been left in place, but some of the smaller ones have been thinned out using the mulcher. And this will be used as a fire break for future prescribed fires. In the lower right-hand corner, so yeah, this was the area that was mulched in the upper left-hand corner. In the lower right-hand corner, this area was thinned first using a feller buncher. You can see some of the old logs there on the ground in order to open up the canopy a little bit and allow some of these herbaceous fuels to grow up once they were exposed to the sunlight. You know, if this park were located in East Texas, this could be done via a timber sale. So we could mark the trees that we wanted removed, and actually that wood could go to use, but there aren't any sawmills close by, not close enough to make it commercially viable. So we've had to figure out what to do with these trees once they're cut, which basically has just been to burn them up in prescribed fire. So there it is again, our sort of idealized mature pine woodland. So a semi-closed or semi-open state in between being a forest and a savanna, with a healthy grass and flora of understory, and even the next generation of regeneration coming up into those openings. So what does the next 10 years look like? That was the previous 10 years and the previous 400 years before that. Well, currently there is a management plan under review that has recommendations for stand density and species composition, as well as for managing for different types of habitat. The challenge of selecting a desired future state is a problem of choosing when to restore to. What I mean by that is we know to varying degrees of certainty what the forest used to look like, but how sustainable is that given current and expected climate conditions? We can't restore to something that happened during the Little Ice Age 400, 500 years ago, because those conditions will not be present in the atmosphere going forward. So our best approach is to find a time in the past when conditions were right that we can reasonably restore to, which is, to our best knowledge, immediately prior to settlement. And that would be based on both fire histories that we've developed and accounts of early visitors and settlers who described very large trees that would fall in a big wind. And then also areas of refugia that were extremely thick. So we think these were probably more the riparian areas. It's going to require ongoing monitoring. So we have fuels monitoring sites set up throughout the park and throughout the park system, where we can track the accumulation of wildland fuels and also the species composition. And there's there's also opportunities for research on the park into different management techniques and different post-fire effects now 10 years out. And then the park is continuing to acquire, or has at least recently acquired, new land. This would have been old agricultural fields. So the first step will be restoring that good native grass layer, and that'll involve a series of herbicide treatments followed by burns and some rotation thereof, maybe also disking. We haven't quite settled on that yet. And followed by using a native seed mix to create a good, vibrant native grass community that we can plant pines into. So can't just go straight into reforesting necessarily. We're going to set the scene first. In conclusion, it's going to take, and it has taken, intensive management techniques in order to restore and to continue to manage and to continue to restore this ecosystem. Prescribed fire is one very effective way that we can get fire back on the landscape in a constructive manner, in a safe and healthy manner that will benefit the forest as opposed to damage it. But there are limitations and barriers to implementing prescribed fire, not the least of which is containment and also smoke management issues. We want to be good neighbors, and we don't want to smoke people out. It's a real public safety issue as well. So there are other tools available, such as mechanical and chemical that we looked at earlier. But all these are high input, very hands-on management techniques. This is following the fire. It's not about letting nature take its course. It's about trying to actively restore the landscape and to reintroduce fire as a part of that. Not the smallest of challenges is managing public attitudes. People are understandably fire shy following the Bastrop complex and that Hidden Pines fire in 2015. Helping the public come to an understanding that this fire is there to benefit the forest and to protect them by limiting the severity of future and spread of future wildfires. What can you do as a master naturalist to help meet these ends? Well, you can participate in and promote prescribed fire. There are prescribed burn associations across the state, and I've provided a link there that you can go to find one in your area, and that's to help you manage your property and so that you can go help manage your neighbor's property as well using the tool of prescribed fire. Fire is not necessarily in and of itself the answer. It's just part of the answer, and it's something you have to answer to. So if in areas where fire is not feasible as a tool, whether the property is too small or there are public safety issues, there are other techniques that you can take to mimic the role of fire on the landscape, such as hand thinning with chainsaws, mechanical mulching, and targeted use of herbicides. And then last but not least, we need advocates. We need people out there advocating for the use of fire, what we call good fire on the landscape. We need people educating the public on fire's historic role in the landscape, and why managers choose to use prescribed fire to restore their ecosystems. Thank you so much for listening to my talk. I would like to encourage you to reach out to me if you want a copy of any of these studies. I can forward them to you at this email address that I've included. Thanks again.
Thank you, Wade. We have questions pouring in, so I'm going to start at the top with moderating some of those, and we'll go down the list. The first question we had come in asked about the MFI maps that you showed, and what the source and the coordinating agency was for those.
Great. Yeah, so that was from the Joint Fire Science Program, which is a joint venture of the DOI and United States Forest Service. I believe Mark Stambaugh was the lead on that study, and they looked at fire histories available in the form of fire scars on trees, and then also charcoal layers in soil samples that they had taken at I think 170 sites over the country. They used that sample data and that fire history, and they correlated it to climate data. Mainly they looked at precipitation totals and climate chemistry, so how much oxygen, carbon dioxide, and so forth in the atmosphere at those locations. And then using that climate data, they used that to project the fire history across the landscape. And if that person is interested, or if anyone is interested in that study, they can email me at this address, and I can forward you the PDF of it.
I'll take the next turn, and then Michelle and I will go back and forth asking you questions that are coming in on the Q&A box. One of the questions came in asking about how Master Naturalist as landowners can help to prevent fire risk on their own property with mechanical or manual removal. Specifically, her question is asking about thicker understory, but I think you could probably capture some of the at-home tips fairly quickly for all levels of the understory.
Absolutely, that's a great question. So she hit the nail on the head. Really, the first fuel to target is what we call the ladder fuels. So anything that reaches that forms a connection between the forest floor and those first branches of the canopy, or even the upper canopy. So those would be the first things to target for removal. And in this area, those are likely to be yopon, maybe bodark, but really it'll be dependent on the size and the arrangement of that shrub or small tree. The next step would be the removal of things like vines, and lower branches, just to kind of lift the canopy. Again, we're not trying to eliminate any one species. We're just trying to change the arrangement of the fuel so that fires coming in will drop down out of the canopy and back down to the forest floor. There's information available from the Texas A&M Forest Service about home ignition zone, and they have specific treatments recommended for areas around your home and structures. And so those will be a little bit broader treatments, and will also involve landscaping choices. But I would direct you to those resources. There are some very good resources out there.
We have another question that came in regarding the fire changing the soil pH, and how did that affect replanting?
So there's, I can't speak directly to pH. I can talk a little bit, and I'm sure there have been studies on pH done. So I would encourage all of you with a curious mind to look into the literature on that. But I can't speak directly to pH. I can talk to the development of hydrophobic soils, which of course make it much more challenging for seedlings planted in those heaviest burned areas to access moisture, because a lot of it gets intercepted at that first layer of the soil. There were also some unexpected studies that came out regarding soil moisture and availability following the fire. One of the interesting ones, a graduate student here on the park, I believe, did a transect from areas of high burn intensity to areas that were only scorched, and found that the highest burned areas, this is granted about a year after the fire, so the hydrophobic soils would have at this point sloughed off. But in the areas that were remaining, there was actually more soil moisture in the highest areas of burn intensity. And the conclusion was that it was probably because there was less interception first from the canopy of the trees. So less water was actually hitting the forest floor in areas that had burned less. So in the areas where the canopy had been removed, all the rain hit the ground, right? And then there was less evapotranspiration because there was less plant material there. So in the areas that had burned with less severity, you still had mature trees that were pulling the moisture out of the soil and releasing it into the atmosphere, whereas that was just staying and pooling in the areas of greater burn intensity. The silver lining, of course, to that study was areas that we were able to plant in the high burn intensity had more moisture that they could draw from. So I'm sorry I wasn't able to directly address the question, but hopefully there was some interesting side notes.
That's great. I hadn't even thought about it from that angle. I'm going to ask a few questions and I'm going to try and lump them together, asking about what fauna has returned to the park, or if there were any reintroductions needed. And then the second question that's slightly tied into that is the use of dead trees for nesting, or if there were any dead trees intentionally left for cavity nesters.
Excellent question. Both of those questions are really good. So yes, as a matter of fact, I think the big species people like to talk about with the lost pines is the Houston toad, which is our critically endangered toad species, of course, that used to stretch from Bastrop all the way to Houston, and now is found only in the lost pines. Populations were declining prior to the fire for a number of reasons. And at least on the park, the fire really dealt a critical blow to our toad population. So efforts are being made by the Houston Zoo to captively breed and release toads in Bastrop County. But currently they're focusing on other sites on private lands that are more promising. In the meantime, we are working on trying to create good toad habitat on the park again. Before doing any large-scale releases here, though there have been some releases on the park. The main focus of the toad efforts right now is on monitoring to try to see if they are coming back. That's sort of the stage that we're at, and I think that there may be either scheduled later or has been recently a talk on the toads, and no, there's not. But anyway, I would encourage people to look into that. It's interesting stuff. And then to the point of species returning, I recently got to look at some game cameras, and there was reports of ringtails before the fire, but no one had actually recorded one until this season, actually, and we caught a ringtail on one of our game cameras, so that was exciting. As far as other wildlife species, the populations have been returning and actually returned pretty quickly post-fire, mostly because it had opened up areas, I think, where it was easier to observe them than it was before. But I just thought the ringtail was an interesting thing, since we knew that they were supposed to be here historically, but hadn't really seen one, and then we saw one this year. So, and then dead trees as habitat. So absolutely, there are still snags that are standing from the 2011 fire, and partially the choices to leave them there were a number of reasons. Of course, some were cut down in the interest of erosion control early on, to try to build windrows to hold the soil in place with mixed success. But mainly it just would have been too much effort for not enough gain to go through and cut all of them down. So really a lot of them stayed on the park, and the ones that have fallen as a result of becoming too rotten or of prescribed burning. So we definitely still have a lot of dead standing as habitat for a number of creatures.
So there's a couple of questions regarding this restoration effort, and two of them I'm going to ask together. One is actually there's three that kind of revolve around those. Can you describe the restoration effort a little bit more in detail? Like where did the seedlings come from?
Mm-hmm.
There's also a question in there about the cost of this restoration effort annually, and then or over the past years and then going forward. And then lastly, related to that, one person made a comment about there's a restoration and management plan for the Bastrop State Park complex. And so with this restoration, with kind of going through some of that restoration, can you talk a little bit about kind of your positions and Greg's position,
Mm-hmm.
and how they also develop management and restoration plans for the other state parks in the state?
Absolutely. So starting with the seedlings, the very first wave of seedlings that were planted as part of the reforestation came from a seed orchard in East Texas. Now the trees themselves were planted from seed from Bastrop County. So this population is slightly genetically different from their siblings in East Texas, in that they're considered drought hardy loblolly. So it's a slightly different genetic strain. It's a little squatter and shorter than the trees in East Texas, and it can tolerate the temperature extremes and the precipitation troughs that we have here in Central Texas. Luckily, there was already some planted for seed stock in Magnolia, Texas, at a seed orchard run by the Texas A&M Forest Service, and that was the initial population that was used to put back out. Since then, there has been seed collection here on the state park, so that we know that we're getting the genetics that are closest to where we're planting them, and those are grown out, back east at commercial nursery facilities, and then shipped back here. But they are 100% lost pine genetics, and that's the majority of what we've been putting in the ground. To the cost, I have to apologize. I'm pretty new in the position. I do know that there's a number of cost centers that this comes from, and a fair amount. For instance, my position is funded through money that came from the settlement with Bluebonnet Electric Co-op following the fire. So going forward, the next 5 to 10 years, we're gonna be well funded to implement these management techniques in a way that is not normally accessible, I feel like, for state agencies under normal situations. So we are blessed in that respect. And And then can you repeat some of the other questions? I'm sorry.
Yeah, the other question was about the management. So like the restoration and management that you're in charge of for Bastrop, can you kind of give a little bit of background on what exists as far as staff and management plans for other parks across
Great.
our whole state system?
Absolutely. So it really has been a collaborative process that predates my time here, and that really started soon after the fire. So you know, the current management plan for the Lost Pines State Parks is being worked on with Greg Creasy, Jeff Sparks, and some consulting foresters from the private industry. You know, a fair amount of our management planning is contracted out. Raven Environmental handles a fair amount, and other consultants and vendors as well, in conjunction with TPWD leadership. But it's not something really that any one person or even any one agency can take on by themselves. So you know, I'm currently, I work, so at the park, there is, on park staff, there's a natural resource specialist. His name's Jason May. Some of you may know him. There are two people, myself included, that work for the Wildfire program under natural resources. So myself and another specialist. And then there is also a regional natural resource specialist who's sort of a lateral to us at the regional office. So what's currently called the Wildfire program is kind of undergoing a rebranding. I think they haven't settled on a name yet, but it's going to be something along the lines of ecosystem restoration program or habitat management, you know, something along those lines. Just to kind of give a context of the scope of work we do, you know, wildfire being only one component of habitat management. So it's really at that regional sort of level that these plans are made. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. So I guess to sum that up, that one person expressed concern over, you know, there's you mentioned that there's a plan in restoration and monitoring plan for Bastrop. There are other personnel all across the state from both Parks Division and Wildlife Divisions that work cooperatively together to develop management and restoration plans for all of our parks statewide. So
correct. This is not unique. That exists. Yeah,
right.
Yes, right. It's not unique to Bastrop State Park. It is in place across the state, and it is a collaboration, you know, with both within and across TPWD. Thank you.
Excellent, Wade. And I have the opportunity to do one last wrap-up question with you because we are over time. And thank everybody for staying on just a little bit longer past 1 o'clock. I wanted to start the question with a great quote in the chat. Somebody said, watching this, I see how a prescribed fire definitely keeps an unexpected fire from devastating large areas. So definitely some great education and lots of great praise coming through the chat. But the kind of what we can do question that I love to end with Master Naturalist. We had a couple of folks say, how can we educate others? What resources are out there? What are the tools in the toolbox for the Master Naturalist to take the messages that you've shared to their communities?
Great, yeah. So I'm really glad that people are interested in doing that, because I really do think that that's sort of the final frontier in wildland fire management and in ecosystem restoration more broadly, is how to spread this message. So there are some really good products on the TPWD YouTube page about the role of fire in the landscape. and the use of prescribed fire as a tool. There is the Texas A&M Forest Service has a section on its website dedicated to prescribed fire, and that link that I posted earlier about the Prescribed Burn Associations of Texas would really give you as master naturalists a chance to get your feet wet, particularly if you have an interest in becoming a fire practitioner yourself, but at least meeting other fire practitioners in your area, finding out what their challenges are, finding out what how you can help. It really is going to take I think a good deal of public advocacy to educate our neighbors about the use of fire and how it benefits not just our native ecosystems, but our communities as well.
I was listening to a prescribed burn workshop actually this morning through A&M Extension, and they were talking the same thing about creating a fire culture here in Texas. Yep,
absolutely.
And that's where Master Naturalists have a step ahead.
And thank you actually for bringing up the extension. The A&M Extension service also has a wide variety of resources available, including how to become a prescribed burn manager.
Great. With that, Wade, we want to say thank you so much for joining us, and for all of our participants today. Thank you guys for joining us as well. As mentioned at the beginning of the event today, we have been recording this presentation and we'll get it posted on our website, if not later this afternoon, by tomorrow morning. And thank you so much, Wade.
Thanks. It was fun.
Thank you, Wade. There's so many congratulations and thank yous in the chat or Q&A for you, and mentioning just how great your presentation was, how much they learned, and lots of ideas for follow-up presentations too. So we may see you back, or we may ask you back pretty soon.
Great. All right. Thank you very much. That sounds like fun.
And a big thanks for everything that you're doing.
Thank you.
All right, and with that, Michelle, I'm going to stop the recording and stop the live stream. Thank y'all.